This is part 2 of chapter 22 on natural selection. And I have on the screen a picture of an example of Darwin's finches from the Galapagos and South America. And you can see they're similar in coloring, but look at the different shapes of the beaks. And this is one of those things that Darwin noticed. And again, we actually have had a series of American scientists just a few decades ago that studied in the Galapagos, and they were there during a severe drought period, and they had some very interesting research that they did. But if you look at here, the Galapagos Islands are, although very close in proximity, their climate is very different. And any of you who have gone to Aruba, for example, has a tropical side and a desert side of the island. And this is what happens in some of the Galapagos Islands as well. So in the desert side of some of these islands, they have the cactuses that you would expect. And the bill of the finches have evolved to be able to eat that food source. On other islands that are very tropical with a lot of insects, they found that the beak and the ability of the finch to even fly very quickly is adapted to be able to catch insects in the air. And then if you look at this very stout beak, this is an example of one of the finches that its food source is mainly seeds. And of the two American scientists that have been there recently, and there was a severe drought in the Galapagos, they noticed that within just a few generations, there was quite a difference in the beaks. The birds that had the very large, wide beaks for large nuts, and we had very small beaked birds for very tiny seeds. Neither one of those populations did very well in the drought. There weren't enough of the trees stopped making the large seeds as a protective device so that they survived. And the seed-bearing smaller plants also, for the exact same reason, didn't produce seeds. The medium-sized birds, which were just sort of a subpopulation, had the medium-sized beaks, did the best. There was enough leftover food of both kinds that population seemed to be able to survive, and within just 3 or 4 years had enough children that the percentage of birds that they were catching for their study in the Galapagos were all of the medium-sized beaks. And I'm going to pause for just a moment so I can switch my screens. And this is a picture out of the textbook and the PowerPoints where they show up here where we would have a original common ancestor. And these branches, this is called a cladogram or a family tree. These branches show you how closely related an organism is. So here we have the original ancestor, and we have branches of this. And here you see manatees, or a relative of those. And then we come down where we have another big branch. These are extinct. And eventually what you're seeing is that we have subcategory evolution happening, so that what we have left is the species of elephant that we see today in Africa and in Asia. We're familiar with with woolly mammoths during the time period of the Ice Age. So again, this was one of Darwin's thoughts. This would have been the family tree or the cladogram, and the closer the branches, the most closely that they're related. And I will pause again. And one of the very correct observations that Darwin made as far as evolution is concerned is, number one, that there already was artificial selection even during his time period. They had been artificially selecting racehorses, and in this example from your PowerPoint, they show where botanists have taken the wild mustard and have created a series of different plants, have genetically modified them. So we've got from the tip of the bud here, we get they've been able to modify to get cabbage, to get broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, for example. So besides the artificial selection of plants and horses, we've been doing this for hundreds of years as far as dogs are concerned. And so that gave Darwin the idea that if we can artificially change characteristics in somebody, then that perhaps could happen naturally as well. And his next big observation was that members of a population often vary in inherited traits. Just look at humans, and you have red hair color and brown and blonde and different color eyes. But the PowerPoint has a very interesting picture of little ladybugs. And if you just look at the variation in them, look at the different sizes of the spots, different coloration on the heads here, variations where some have virtually no spots at all. And so all of this are qualities that during different environmental changes or different problems, some of these little guys would have a much better chance of surviving during different environmental situations. So that is one of those observations that he all said, is that their population varies. The next observation he made was that all species can produce more offspring than an environment can withstand. So in this case, we'll keep the same slide up. Here we have a little ladybug population, and there's quite a few of them. So if there's X amount of food source, it just makes sense that not all are going to survive. Those who have the stronger fitness, able to shove the others out of the way, are a little bit stronger, can get more food. Many of you have heard the stories of a cat or a dog that have an especially large litter, and there is not enough milk for all of the kittens or all the puppies. And in fact, the stronger of the puppies will shove the little runt of the litter out, and often for that pup in nature, they wouldn't survive, but with people, they can bottle feed the pup. So we know that, number one, variety. In any population, there's a large variety. Number two, we know that in nature, always the population makes more than they can sustain. And we've talked about reaching carrying capacity even on our planet. And from his observations, he came up with this inference from that. And his thoughts were that individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving, in other words, they have better reproductive fitness, they're stronger, their coloration is better in a specific environment, they are just going to have more offspring than the others. And that's how we get that population to evolve. We have groups that have naturally inherited traits that make them better off for survival. And if we go back to the original scientist that influenced Darwin, I talked about Malthus, the mathematician, and he noted that the potential for human population to increase faster than we have a food supply for happened. And so, again, those organisms that are able to get their food better than another of their species will survive to have children. I've been watching over the last 2 or 3 weeks a tiny little bird up here in Maine called the flycatcher, and they're fairly small and they have a long tail, and as they sit on the fence or whatever, the tail will go up and down, and they survive off of insects. Well, since I've been up here, we've had 2 snowstorms. I would say the insect population is pretty poor. Last week, the pair of them started building a nest as they did last year in the eaves of my little porch. And I was thinking, wow, this is pretty early for them to be building a nest. And sure enough, we just got 8 inches of snow and power outages, etc. So I've been watching them rather aggressively, like pushing up out of the snow, trying to get bugs out of the leaves, etc. So they probably migrated sooner than they should. And so the odds that these 2 will survive over the next 2 or 3 weeks, honestly, is poor. Survival of the fittest. They came too early. And here's a really interesting picture of that survival of the fittest and your environmental changes, where many a scientist has said, depending on location, the organisms that adapt to their environment are going to have a better chance of survival. Well, we have an insect here in Borneo, where it's called a leaf mantid, and look at the antenna and the eye, and look at this very specific environment that they see. And then we have Malaysia, where we are going to have the exact same species, but in a different environment, and look how they've adapted. And of course, the praying mantis is one of their cousins, and they, of course, around here, are green. And this statement here is almost always an AP biology question asked by College Board and often pops up on the honor CP tests, where they'll ask you about whether an individual evolves or the population. And please remember, individuals may have mutations, but evolution needs to have generations to occur. So it's the population that evolves. To show just how evolution can happen, we talk about bacteria where it's resistant, and also the soapberry bug. So the soapberry bug is this insect that is found very prevalent in Florida. And depending on where in Florida, and depending on what they're feeding on, depending on where their location is, because Florida is a fairly long state, they'll either have what they call an insect beak or not. So, and that happened within just a very few short generations of this adaptation of how they're going to feed and whether or not they needed that mouthpiece or beak or not. And of course, adaptation is not just for insects or birds. Bacteria, unfortunately, is one that can adapt very readily. And so Staphylococcus aureus, very common on our skin, oftentimes doesn't cause us any issues. More often than not, it'll be from a hospital setting where the staph will get in when you've had surgery. MRSA, though, is a term you may have heard before, and it is actually initials for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And it's very, very dangerous. It is known it can wipe out an entire wing in a nursing home. It's highly contagious, easily spread from healthcare worker to a patient. Of course, older people will have an immune system that is not fully functional, and so they quickly get it. And this type of Staphylococcus will colonize someplace in the body. It can be in the lungs, it can be in the urinary tract area. My mother, for example, developed or caught MRSA when she had a surgical procedure done in Boston when she was 90. And she actually was very happy. She survived she was very ill for a period of time, but she survived it. But of course, the bacteria remains in her body. And so one of the things she was happy with is anytime she had a small hospitalization after there, she had to be in a quarantine space because MRSA is that catchy to another person. So she always got a private room. She didn't have to share. And in fact, at one point where she had a stroke and had to go into rehab for a few weeks, I was visiting with her in rehab, and another patient gets rolled in, and she screamed, "I have MRSA. I can't have a roommate." And the woman being reeled in screamed, "I have MRSA. I can't have a roommate." And so it ended up the healthcare providers knew both of them had MRSA, so together they got to be, and neither were happy with that. So different species can evolve very, very quickly. And if you look at the timeline here, so MRSA, we knew that Staphylococcus became resistant to penicillin way back in 1945, and that's just a few years after penicillin was starting to be used as an antibiotic. And then Staphylococcus also became resistant to a drug, methicillin, that we really held out for as being, if penicillin wouldn't work, that would work. So currently there is nothing that is very effective against MRSA, which shows you just how dangerous these resistant bacteria are. And I briefly talked about the fossil evidence and how there were homologous structures, so the structures that were very similar. So in a person, we have the humerus, the cat has the humerus, the bat, the whale, they have a humerus. It's not as similar as to ours. And if you take anatomy, or you are taking anatomy, you will have seen I have quite an extensive collection of bones and fossils that I show. I have a fossilized pelvis that looks almost identical to a human pelvis. The difference is in how porous it is. So the homologous structures really is one of those factors that help prove that evolution does happen. And one of the things that is kind of interesting to look at is that sometimes we have an organism that is very in two very different environments. And so the flying squirrel of North America and the sugar glider of Australia would be an example. And so evolutionists say that there is what we call convergent evolutions, or analogous organisms. So where we have two different, very different species environments. So in other words, the North American flying squirrel that we would find in New England, very heavily in New England,